So to my left, we have Gustavo Collantes, the Chief Strategy Officer at NAD Grid. We have Lawrence Orsini from LO3, founder and principal, and finally Adam Richard, the CEO of Volt Markets. So I guess to start, I'm going to let you guys do a little bit of introduction. I want to talk about, say, what you're doing in the transactive energy space. So how do you interact there? Gustavo, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, thank you, Colin, for hosting this session. And first of all, I want to apologize because I'm late today. Had a long flight, so if I am stumbling in my speech, I hope you are able to forgive me. So very glad to be here. I'm Gustavo Collantes. I'm the CSO for NAD Grid. I am based in Chicago right now. I'm thinking about maybe moving to New York or perhaps California, trying to decide where I want to go first. So I joined NAD Grid about 2 months ago, coming out of ICF, a global consulting company, lured by this idea of bringing more choice, more efficiency, and growth in markets for clean electricity. That's kind of the overarching goal I think we will pursue here. But NAD Grid is taking a very focused approach to enabling efficient markets. So we believe that given the trends that we see in the market today and coming up in the next 5 or so years, there will be a need for something more granular, more efficient, more peer-to-peer, and we are trying to provide that platform for that future to happen.
Great. And Lawrence?
Yeah, so LO3 Energy at this point is really focused on getting data from the grid edge. So it's really interesting to have these conversations about transactive energy and talking about how we might do peer-to-peer and how we might actually get machine-to-machine transactions happening. But at its core, the thing that we're missing to do that is data, the information to actually pass back and forth between machines or between people about these transactions. Here in New York, you still have people that walk around and write down consumption for the utility. Con Ed doesn't have smart meters. They have people that walk around and write down consumption. So a good half of the meter reads in New York are estimated, right? Because they couldn't get into the basement, the dog was home, whatever it might be. So I got involved in transactive energy probably about 2006, and it's the idea that you can run and balance the grid at the grid edge is really interesting, but the physical ability to do that across hardware is really expensive and hard to get to. So when I came across blockchain technology and looked at that, we look at it more as a communications platform and a way to permission and depermission the data that comes from the grid edge. It was pretty clear to me that this is a way we can actually start to engage at the grid edge and create transactive grid.
Great.
So my name's Adam. So probably the youngest company on the stage by far, and we've been focused on how we can build a reliable and solution that successfully solves pretty much all the problems with renewable energy credits. And the reason for doing that is because it allows us to install the infrastructure needed to access the hardware components on the grid and show that our technology can actually create a market. Once doing that, then our more long-term strategy is to enable the transactive component of that technology and allowing for the privacy and scalability components that are obviously big obstacles that we're all facing.
Great. And I actually want to go ahead and start with a question from the audience that I'm seeing here, and I think would be helpful, which is what's the difference between the transactive grid and transactive energy? So I think sort of getting to the definitions before we launch into the problems with doing this. So I don't know, Lawrence, if you want to take a first stab at that, or maybe just how you're defining what the transactive energy space is.
For us, it's a brand. We own the trademark on transactive grid. So it's just a brand.
So do we have to pay you every time we say it on stage here?
Not yet. Not yet. No, but transactive energy really the concepts of transactive energy will enable what is ultimately a transactive grid. So the idea that the utility grid itself can actually run at the edge, in a very fluid, a very dynamic, and a scalable way. So I don't think that there's much of a difference between them, actually.
Okay. Any differing opinions on stage? If not, I'm gonna move forward. So I think when we think about this transactive energy, right? There's the consumer or the prosumer, right, which is a producer and consumer for anyone who hasn't heard the term for the umpteenth time, is getting them engaged, right? We always talk about customer engagement from the utility side, and I think that's equally important from the startup side, right? How do you get customers? How do they want to engage with energy? So I'd like to sort of focus on that. And so I guess for you, Gustavo, like how are you guys approaching getting consumers and engaging them? And who are your customers? I mean, maybe you're approaching utilities more, but
That's a very easy question, Colin. I've been working on innovation for about, I want to say now 15 years, and I'm coming mainly from working quite a bit on the EV space. And I think I'm bringing quite a few lessons from that market onto this market. So we look at this in a couple, what I think are important ways. And one is, yes, we are doing something that we all feel is disruptive. But, the average person doesn't deal very well with that, potentially overwhelming disruption. They don't like something that is very different. So we are trying to keep as much as possible the concept of disruption out, but the tangible disruption on the back end. So the consumers don't really have to do much different. And much of that went into our thinking of our blockchain architecture, so that both the consumer on one side and the supply side, utilities and the likes on the other side, don't really need to do something that is completely different. So we felt that's very important to grow market quickly. In terms of accessing the consumers, we do believe very much in partnership with established partners like utilities, for example. They have access to the consumer. I think that's for us the more important channel we plan to pursue.
So now, Lawrence, you guys have had a lot of access to consumers without going by the utility. So can you talk a little bit about, it doesn't have to be the Brooklyn microgrid, it can be another one, but sort of how you've gone out and engaged consumers?
I'll talk more about my team to begin with. So good core of my team comes from the utility space. So deploying utility scale, efficiency, emerging tech, distributed generation, retro-commissioning projects with customers. So we would build, design, and deploy these projects. And this is all about talking with customers about emerging tech, new technologies that's really hard to understand. So energy is a hard thing to understand, but efficiency makes it even harder. It's like, well, wait a minute, that thing that I don't even see moving through the walls, that magic thing that keeps the lights running, somehow it runs better if I put a new technology in. So the most important thing is to really talk to people in ways that they can understand. So when you explain to people how, let's just, for example, a rec market works, and that while you're buying the global environmental benefit of a renewably generated kilowatt hour somewhere, the odds of it actually being in your community is really minuscule. So I will go to Brooklyn because it's one of the best stories. So in one of the first focus groups we had in Brooklyn, there was a woman there, Janet, who's like, well, wait a minute. You're saying I'm paying for this thing, I'm not actually getting the electrons? It's like, well, no. You're buying wind energy. The closest wind energy is maybe upstate New York. It's not even on the same physical network, right? You can't get those electrons. They can't get to you. It's like, well, wait, where does this electricity come from? It's like, well, we can walk out and I can point to the smokestack where the electricity comes from. She's like, oh, hold on a minute. I've been using more energy than I would have because I wanted to support this industry. Are you telling me I'm actually polluting my community more? It's like, well, that's kind of how it works, right? not all is lost. There are people that are actually producing renewable energy here in the community. There's actually one small wind plant. You just can't buy it from them, right? So you can buy it from a big producer that's got cheap land somewhere upstate that's selling it to the grid, but you can't buy it from your neighbor across the street. So that was, that really hits home pretty quickly with people who are already engaged, in the idea of green energy, renewable energy, and want a different choice to begin with. If you're going to talk with people about energy who really haven't thought about this, you have to explain it to them in ways, give them ways to think about it that they can understand, right? I have no way to value an electron. I've never tasted one. I've never had it in my pocket, right? The only way you can do that is comparatively. So it's like kids' asthma, Starbucks. Kids' asthma, Starbucks. We need a way that people can actually do that. So the team really focuses on how can you engage these different customers in ways that they can understand.
Great. And Adam,
Yep.
I think on the rec side where you guys are starting, are you focusing mostly on people who are already purchasing RECs, or are you trying to create a system that's easier to be able to expand that market and who's buying?
Yeah, so our customers we're talking to today are typically wind generators, and we're offering a solution for them to be able to better audit and report their REC generation and the transfers and sales of those RECs, but also integrate into existing hardware in order to also offer a preventative maintenance solution at the same time. And while we're doing that, we're also talking to, being from Houston, Texas, also talking to a lot of the big energy trading shops about how their wholesale power trading can be further optimized in the back office processes, ultimately connecting these two things together so that the wholesale power traders are directly having an impact on the SCADA and PLC systems.
Yeah, definitely. So I think I'm seeing a lot of questions pop up in the Q&A, and one of the areas topics I want to jump to is on the regulation front. I think Transactive Energy gets a lot of questions. So on regulation, so what are the sort of, biggest challenges that you currently see on a regulatory side from being able to enact the vision you might have for Transactive Energy? So Gustavo, what do you think?
First again. Yeah, it's an important question. Maybe I should start by saying that I really like the way you structure this panel, because I see innovation as a system. So it doesn't happen in silos of the consumer and then utilities or government and so on. So they're all very much connected, right? So, I think we face a number of questions, but the one I like to point out the most right now is maybe connecting back to my comments before is how do you make those risk-averse, slow-moving institutions, established institutions, more comfortable with these new ideas? Very few people know what blockchain is, much less what it really means for the grid. And it's upon us to explain those concepts to people who are there to enable this ultimately, comfortably. So for us, we find the challenge in different places. As we talk to state agencies and other players, we have different questions. Many of those are coming from the side of, is this going to result in any impact on resiliency or reliability and so on? So I wouldn't like to point out, of course we have the SEC proceedings and all those things that are kind of a pending question upon our heads, but I think what I deal the most often with that kind of communication with people who are there to provide the rules and let them feel comfortable with this, something that we understand and that we want to provide tangible, real solutions to them.
Yeah, that's really interesting. One of the things I think I want to highlight, and Lawrence, I want to ask you about this is, so you mentioned, sort of the reliability and resilience front. And I think when you start talking about Transactive Energy, there's a real question of, utilities are often maybe afraid of starting with it because of how it could impact reliability and resilience. But I think you guys are trying to take a tack of how it can increase reliability and resilience, Lawrence. So, I'm curious your thoughts on that and whether you've spoken with regulators at all about that.
Oh, yeah. Probably about 30% of our focus is talking with regulators. So this is not a revolution. This is not even disruptive. You can't disrupt a regulated market. This is an evolution of a regulated market. So you need to be able to, as a regulator, first and foremost, I don't get to change regulations or make policy based on thought experiments, right? I need to see that people want to do a thing. The technology is at a stage where that thing can actually be done. And ultimately, it doesn't break the grid or the business models that are in place today to make sure that the grid's there. So it's incumbent on us to actually take that information to the regulators and involve them in the process. So on all the projects that we're working on, some of them, the regulators are pretty closely involved. Others where they're not involved, we have an institute that is putting together a white paper, right, a third-party white paper, to take this information directly back to regulators so they can actually make some of these changes. When it gets down to transactive energy, it is a big, hairy, scary problem, right? The idea that the grid can run itself at the edge is something that is people have been talking about for many years, but is just now, actually technologically becoming feasible. So in order to accelerate that, you have to really look at ways of providing information ahead of regulation. So here in New York has done a terrific job with REV to start to dig into how do we change business models so that it aligns with this technology, this technological future that is not going to stop. One of the ways that they're doing it now is really taking a look at the value stack for energy. So how you get paid, what you get paid for, at what resolution, where it might actually be. So we're actually starting to put together a synthetic value stack that goes quite a bit deeper than they're thinking, because you need to take it to them and say, well, look, if we can measure this at the grid edge, we can affect it at the grid edge, then this is something that can be valued differently for market participants, not just a utility, but a solar developer, somebody that's going to put a battery on the grid, or even a consumer. But you have to work with regulators to do that stuff. We all want the lights to stay on.
So for Volt Markets, the size of our team is we're below 10 people. So we don't really have a lot of resources to allocate as much time as LO3 is on speaking to regulators. So what we've been doing is staying focused on how we can build our technology to replicate jurisdictional regulatory compliance, such that anyone that has access to a commodity or wants to interact as a broker has to be authorized to do so, and so that the assets can only be transferred to those that are allowed to be transferred to. At the same time, we are working on an area that the assets or commodities can be also represented as paper attestations. So where you can attest to something like a REC, then it also offers you more freedom to do things a little more creatively and not have to worry about what the regulators are going to come back to us with today. So it's a conversation we want to be more involved in, and we'll get there.
I think the most important thing is to just have one toe over the line of existing regulation. You don't want to put a whole foot over the line, but you want to have a toe over the line, so you're in the conversation.
No, that's true. Can I add one more thing about the resiliency part? I think it's a very important question. We don't think about blockchain as, of course, the solution in itself. It's a platform for the solution. So the way that markets can happen, the peer-to-peer markets can happen, is, that can take many shapes. So the question is there an intelligence behind your market, behind your platform that kind of optimizes those transactions in ways that are bringing benefits to power flows, basically. It's not just about the transactions themselves that could happen in many random ways. That doesn't mean, even though that's providing choice to people, that doesn't mean that will have benefits to the grid necessarily in all cases. So we are very much concerned with that secret sauce behind the blockchain that really enables peer-to-peers that make sense as a system as well, right? So.
Yeah, no, and I think that technical side is important, and so I think we're getting a lot of questions around, or a lot of upvotes on what the top challenge is, or the top thing that's preventing a prosumer from actually producing, selling, and consuming electricity on the grid, which is sort of a technical and/or regulatory question, depending on how you look at it. So I don't know who wants to get first. Lawrence, you might be a good person to start with that one.
Yeah, so it depends on where you are.
Yeah. So maybe from a couple of the markets you've worked in.
Yeah, so let's just say here in the US, typically you have to be at least 100 kW or larger to participate in the market. There are good reasons for this, right? Until a couple of years ago, CalISO was clearing all of their generation plants across an Excel spreadsheet. Right? So you can't have 10,000 PV systems that are trying to clear across an Excel spreadsheet. So that technology's changed, right? They've actually got a terrific vendor that's putting together a pretty amazing database to allow some of that stuff to actually happen much more in real time. So, there are good physical reasons for some of those regulations to be in place. The thing is, those reasons are going away, right? So even with the regulators here in New York, it's clear we've gotten to the point where it's like the technology's in a place where you as a regulator need to consider whether or not you're requiring somebody to participate with an aggregator in order to access a market if they don't have to. If they can access that market directly, then they ought to be able to access that market directly. So one of the projects we're working on in Europe is with EPEX, which is the European Power Exchange. So this is really, it's talking about connecting you as a prosumer consumer directly to the wholesale market, right? Because the technology is right at the edge of being able to do that. So, and if the technology can do that, then regulators have to recognize that, first and foremost. Secondly, if people want to do that, that's the biggest driver.
So I think that brings up an interesting question. We often, when we're talking about blockchain and how it can disintermediate industries, do you think aggregators are one of the bigger industries that are at risk of being disintermediated in this sort of decentralized energy exchange of the transactive grid?
I think aggregators think that aggregators are one of the ones that had particular risk. And retailers. I mean, some of the biggest retailers who've reached out to us have said, well, we kind of see that our heads are the first on the chopping block. So, yeah, it's really interesting to me to see the number of ICOs and startups that are like competing directly with retailers and aggregators. It's like that is probably the most competitive and least useful space for you to actually focus your effort. But run at it. Somebody has to figure that out.
I mean, I don't know, just to propose a vision without really much proof of this, but a potential trend here could be that aggregation will take a different shape than it does today. So as you enable peer-to-peer markets, you can think that potentially you see the market trending towards community solar developments as opposed to rooftop, right? Because in that way you can really tap into the better economics, and you can expand the market. People who today cannot access to rooftop because of they don't have the income to do it, or because they just don't like it, or any reason. When you aggregate in that way, you can really think about the market multi-fold expanding. And I think that's only good news for developers. So I think the notion of the aggregator may change over time, but doesn't have to die.
No. Just like the role of the utility is never going to die, right? Utilities will be in place. We need people. We need companies that keeps the pipes and the wires serviced, that are providing services to make sure that we can put energy on a grid somewhere and take energy back off a grid somewhere efficiently, reliably. When the next hurricane comes through or the big snowstorm comes through and knocks down wires, you don't want a blockchain to fix that. You want a guy in a truck
That's right.
to drive out there and replace that wire, right?
Yes, very true.
Yeah, and so, I mean, Adam, I guess on your side, on the rec side, there are a lot of legacy systems as well. So how do you view the role of what you guys are trying to do, and I guess who are, are you adding a layer on top of things? Are you sort of eliminating other layers that maybe exist with a more efficient version?
Yeah, so it's maybe a bit early for me to dive as deep as you guys have into it, but for us, we're looking at how what we can do today, implementing with hardware, can actually enable this to happen. And the conversation with regulators for us hasn't been very extensive. But on the technological front, I feel pretty confident that we can achieve a lot with what currently exists. Essentially taking any existing infrastructure and we go as close to the production meter as possible to actually enable that to be a blockchain node. We can actually get by with very little resources, so very little CPU, RAM, computational power required, and so on that end we can enable it fairly easily and fairly quickly. But focusing on a long-term goal to provide the infrastructure and the rails for this transactional system is where we've been focused lately.
Yeah, I just want to make clear, right? This is an evolutionary process, right?
Right.
We're talking about
Yeah.
working in a regulated market. You need to be able to make money while you're doing it in a way that's reasonable, one toe over the line today, right? But planning for something that is potentially revolutionary in the future is important as well. You need to know where it's going to go and spend the time and effort and energy to make sure that when you get there, the infrastructure is there. So I think that's probably more of what LO3 is focused on.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. If I
Yeah,
may,
please, go ahead.
I agree with you. I do think that the concept that we are proposing are revolutionary and they are disruptive. I agree with you that getting those to the market and expand market and scale up is going to be an evolution. I mean, you talked about all the convincing needs to take place and so on, which is very true. But maybe we should call it a slow revolution, a slow-moving revolution.
Yeah.
But the concepts is really we're talking about doing things in very different ways, which I think it's good. But it's a bit of the two things at the same time.
Well, a revolution takes people. So you need consumers. You need people to actually engage there. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so that comment leads well into the current top trending question. If a consumer is happy with the price and reliability of their power, why should they care about peer-to-peer or transactive grid?
They shouldn't at all. At all, no. And this is a technology adoption process, right? So as a tech company, as a typical tech company, what you're really focused on is how you grab that first 20, 30% of market share, right? The first 15 you're going to get because these are people that just do that, because it's the coolest thing, it's the neatest thing. Oh, it's blockchain? I don't care what comes behind, it's blockchain. That's cool, I'm going to do that, right? The next 10, 15%, these are people that are really looking like, how can I optimize? How is this different? How is this, how does this give me new options and ideas? This early majority that sits behind them are looking at it going, does it work? Does it make me money? Is it something that's useful to me? And the back half of that market, you never sell to, right? These are people that do it because, oh, he does it. You do it. You do it. Of course. I mean, that's what we do, right? We all have iPhones. We all have, these mobile devices that we carry around now. Right. Apple didn't start selling to my grandmother who had the black phone on the wall. They started selling to techies like me that were willing to stand in line for 3 hours, right, to get the first phones. So the really important component of this is that if you're truly going to evolve a market, you have to start with regulators on the other side, so that even if you don't care about peer-to-peer energy, you're still participating in that market. That market structure needs to change for you, not you.
Yeah. Have you have anything to
Yeah,
add to that? Or?
I agree with what Lauren said. I definitely take the same approach. And what we've been doing lately is having a lot of conversations around what partnerships might look like, where our infrastructure is used for home automation systems that are rolling out, for EV solutions that are just being deployed. If we can go ahead and start putting those systems from day one on this infrastructure, then how can we do it without the people knowing, like the end consumer? They don't know that it's actually happening.
Yeah, I mean, I'm one who, I'm not sure you guys implying this, but just to add on top of what you just said, that why people should care, and people is the market, and the market is not composed of a homogeneous person, right? So there are market segments, and people care about things for different reasons. And on the EV example, why would somebody care about a Nissan Leaf, or why would somebody care about a Tesla, right? So different answers and different motives and offerings and everything. So I think the same applies here. So I do agree that the real reason I think right now lies on kind of an invisible spot. I think Lawrence was saying that with different words. The way that the markets for solar and so on are being supported today are not very sustainable. Mm-hmm. And what we're doing here basically is providing a platform and means for that market to really grow in a more efficient way and be bigger, basically. So if that doesn't happen, something else has to give. So the grid will be less and less efficient, be more and more costly. So in the end, people will notice that. Mm-hmm. So right now it's early stage, so we don't see much of that. We don't even imagine what may happen. But I think the trend has to be addressed and understood right now, I think.
Yeah, definitely. So I want to go to some of these audience questions. So one of them on the, I guess, sort of technical side, and Adam, maybe to start with you on the RECs especially, is how do you make sure these producers are actually producing what they claim, and who do you see regulating or enforcing this? So maybe just talking a little bit about the blockchain and how you actually know that it's actually on a wind farm, let's say.
Yeah, I was just talking about this at lunch with Lawrence. Initially, manually. Like it's a lot of manual work, and right now we're just proving that the technology can do what we say it can do. And so
More meter readers.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so meter readers going out actually saying that yes, it was accurate. So it's a manual process right now as we prove that this will actually work. But in the long term, incentivization mechanisms, building an economic model into your platform that can reward validators or certifiers so that the participants, both humans and machines, are known and are validated to be able to interact with the system in a limited capacity, and also be auditable in the sense that anyone that should be allowed to can see that the machine device has been certified and actually see the credentials behind all that.
Great. And Lawrence, sort of coming off of that same concept, earlier you said you needed data from the grid edge. So what are the characteristics of the physical device that you need to enable this transactive energy?
Yeah, read the white paper. So any data has value if somebody wants it, right? So the whole concept of the platform is even historic data has value. I know a lot of companies that would love to pay for your historic energy use just to do their own predictive analytics on it and planning. But so what we're really focused on is picking up grid edge telemetry, right? So volts, VARs, phase angle, reactive power, the stuff that utility engineers need to know in order to run the grid edge. And then what gets built out of that is derivatives, right? The things that you're going to care about based on pieces of this data. So if you're going to develop a REC, you need to know where was the kilowatt hour produced, what produced it, how much was produced. If it was on a smart inverter, was it selling reactive power benefits, right? Were there other things that it was selling to the grid? So, but at the core, you kind of have to have the grid telemetry, right? Just the core volts, bars, phase angle, reactive power, right at the edge of the grid. So that's a big focus, is figuring out what can collect it today, and most smart meters can collect that stuff and transmit it. But most smart meters are owned by utility companies that maybe don't want to give up that data just yet. So it's a business model twist in there.
Yeah. So I have one here that seems to be getting at the idea of whether you should use tokens or not. So should blockchain transact on kilowatt hours or the dollar amount of the transaction, which I think is trying to get at how we value things on the systems. I don't know, Gustavo, what NAD grid is doing in terms of, are you guys going to be, I know LO3 is all in dollars because it's data, but what is NAD grid looking at in terms of how you're valuing transactions on the blockchain? Are you guys using a token model?
Oh, that's yeah. Well, so we have a single token system. The kilowatt-hour transactions are on dollars. So, and that again, going back to the notion that we want to be constructively disruptive, so to speak. So people continue doing things the way they have so far. So we feel the best way to do that is to not to introduce the notion of a complicated, exotic token that people need to understand what blockchain is, and so on, so on. I think we're all doing dollars, and for now is, I think, the best way to do it. We do have, to answer your question, a token that is more concerned with the carbon footprint of the kilowatt hours. So people can use those whenever they need to, let's say, certify the carbon contained in their kilowatt hours. So whether it's solar, wind, natural gas, or combinations thereof, think of California, I mean, there's some regulations that require a certain level of what they call carbon intensity. They don't really need to be fully zero carbon, so maybe somebody can live without the fully zero emissions, so they can really tailor that preference through NAD, and we can provide to that. So.
Great.
Yeah, I've explored this a lot. I actually consult companies that have done ICOs. So this idea of what a token is or isn't, and if you need one, is one that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. And I was considering going down the path of an ICO about a year ago, have delayed that for the time being. And I think that a token can represent a lot of different things. It can be the collateral behind a letter of credit. It can be a kilowatt hour. It can be some representation of energy that hasn't been consumed or will be gained access to. And they all work. But the most difficult thing is to understand what scales and what can be used by the entire industry and the entire vertical and not break at some point along the way. And how does it scale? To solve the scalability problem, no public blockchain today, I feel, has been tested enough to offer that solution. And putting a token that has some value to it on a private or permissionless chain, I think we're not ready for it yet. So I think that if it represents USD value, looking at things like stablecoins and how they work may be very useful. And we need a scalable solution that works at every segment within the supply chain, and we just don't have it yet.
And as you intimated, the data is the token, and permissioning and depermissioning access to the data is the real value of that token. I'm not a fan of sticking a cryptocurrency in between anything. You're creating friction in a market by putting a cryptocurrency in the middle of an existing transaction, in some ways. So if I build a cryptocurrency that has to work in the US, and it has to work in Europe, and it has to work in Australia, and it has to work in Asia, I've already put an insurmountable hurdle in front of my business model. But building it on top of the thing that every network, everyone that's trying to do this needs to have, which is the data and that quantum of data to make those transactions, just makes total sense for us.
So we're getting to the end of our time here. So I think one of the last things I'm seeing is a couple of technical questions. Specifically, one is, what transaction speed do you need, and are there net neutrality concerns? So maybe instead of answering that, just what do you see as sort of the biggest technical barrier to this adoption in the long term? Maybe not in the current iterations. So Gustavo, let's start with you, and yeah.
Thinking technical barriers in the long term. I would say there's everything that we're using is off the shelf, right? So maybe the further deployment of infrastructure. So NAD Grid is walking into a pilot with a utility as we speak, and we are defining with them what our data needs, right? So they have AMI data that we can tap into, and that's the idea. I think Lawrence mentioned some of that before. We want more than less, of course. But I think I think as we move into this world of DRs and integration into the grid in an efficient manner, that kind of data source has to be present. And to some extent, it's upon us to work with utilities and others to get that deployed. So,
Lawrence, I'll let you.
Yeah, so scalability is the biggest issue. So it's going to take a different architecture than what you've seen today. We're not going to build this on Bitcoin or Ethereum because it's not going to scale to do the things that you need it to do. Besides the way that it's constructed today, that I think they're using together as much energy as Ireland. So we're not going to build a network that actually uses that much energy to transact the values that we're talking about. It's not that I'm not a fan of either Ethereum or Bitcoin. It's just that's not the right technology solution for what we're trying to do at the grid edge. We're talking about a massive amount of data and transactions. So it takes a different architecture. We've been working on that for a couple of years now.
Yeah, there's a few factors at play that come to mind for me at first. One is where are these transactions occurring geographically? So we have to have the infrastructure there to scale. So all that depends on how granular we are with the time interval of this data and how many IoT devices are connected to that blockchain. And then once we have those answers, then a solution where we're okay with a blockchain having its own proof of existence in another blockchain, where that's okay, then I think that we can achieve scalability in the fairly near term, where we have chains of chains. And so that's why we've been looking at an ontological structure to kind of infinitely scale the system. And so it's definitely the blockchain that will ultimately carry the majority of the transactions globally. Yeah, I don't think we're really looking at it yet. It's something that's to be built.
Great. Well, that's unfortunately all the time we have. There are a lot of great questions in here, so I highly recommend everyone who asked those come find these people afterwards. Let's hear it up for our panelists, and thank you.